Well, there's
All right, I think we want so welcome to the penultimate conservation science seminar. We have a pleasure today of introducing Sarah Hobbie. Sarah's native of St. Paul, right? And actually daughter of Russell Hobbie, who was sort of an icon at the university. I don't remember, right? But Sarah ended up eschewing the university and going to Carleton to get a BA in biology. And then she ended up going to UC Berkeley and got a PhD with Stuart Chapin. And then after that, did a postdoc at Stanford with Bertuzzi before coming to the university in the late 1990s. So at the university, she went through the ranks, assistant associate full professor, then became a distinguished professor, and then most recently a Regents professor. So we're really great to have Sarah here. She's an ecosystem ecologist. She did a lot of work at the Cedar Creek LTR site, but then a couple of years ago, got together with some people and put together an urban LTR site here in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Hopefully that's good. Can you hear okay? Awesome. Just start this. Well, thanks for that. Thanks for the shout out to my dad. That's just like so gonna bring tears to my eyes. Yeah, thanks for coming today. And so today I want to talk to you about some work that we started quite a long time ago, actually, and have transitioned into the new LTER that I'm going to mention a little bit throughout the talk. So I don't think that I need to convince this group that people that live in cities get a lot of benefits from urban surface waters. So these are just some examples: food, recreational opportunities, aesthetic and cultural opportunities. So we really value our urban waters. And we've collectively, I take no credit for this, have done a really good job of controlling point source pollution. So if you look at the phosphorus concentrations in the effluent leaving the Metro wastewater treatment plant, those concentrations have really plummeted. But we've been less successful at controlling non-point source pollution. And today I'm going to be focusing primarily on nutrient pollution of surface waters, including nitrogen and phosphorus. So urban waters are especially vulnerable to the impacts of non-point source pollution because of the unique hydrology that basically we've created by creating a high degree of imperviousness in our urban landscapes. And so with parking lots and streets and buildings, we've created this landscape that doesn't allow for infiltration of water. And because of that, those systems are vulnerable to flooding, and we've needed to create dense drainage networks to rapidly move water off the landscape. And so we're also, those drainage networks are also really effective at moving materials and nutrients off of the landscape as well. And so we might envision an urban headwater stream as our city streets, essentially. And the structure of that headwater stream is really different from a non-urban headwater stream. So in a non-urban headwater stream, with apologies to Ray, I'm a terrestrial ecosystem ecologist describing stream ecosystems here. But we have riparian zones, we might have a hyporheic zone, we have a lot of organisms that are living in a diversity of habitats that are interacting with the water and nutrients that are flowing through that stream. In an urban headwater stream, our city streets, the structure of the riparian zone is really different. We don't have a hyporheic zone. And we don't really have habitats in which organisms reside and are able to influence the movement of materials and water and dissolved constituents downstream. And in addition, as we move downstream, a lot of our streams look like this. And so, if you go visit Phelan Creek today, you're not actually visiting Phelan Creek, you're visiting a drainage ditch essentially. And the actual Phelan Creek, at least right now, is essentially in this pipe. There are plans to daylight part of Phelan Creek in the near future. And so today, what I want to talk about is, first of all, some work that we've done taking a watershed approach to understanding the sources of urban nutrient pollution, and then talk about some management opportunities and challenges, and then a little bit about new directions, focused on some of the work that we're doing in the LTER that Ray mentioned. And so I'm going to try to put some of what we're doing, because even though a lot of this work preceded the LTER, I'm going to put this work into the context of what we're trying to do with this relatively new Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area long-term ecological research program, which we call the Changing Nature of Cities, Ecological and Social Dynamics in the Minneapolis-St. Paul Urban Ecosystem. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the US LTER research network, this is a network of sites that are funded by the National Science Foundation. I kind of feel like I have to knock on wood when I say that right now. It consists of 27 sites. These sites are funded on a 6-year cycle. And these sites range all the way from, Arctic coastal sites to open ocean sites on the West Coast, to tropical sites to Antarctica. And they represent a number of different types of biomes. There are currently 2 urban sites in the network. So the Central Arizona Phoenix, or CAP LTER, and the site here in the Twin Cities. We also collaborate and interact quite a bit with a former site in Baltimore. So we're focused on the 7-county metro area. And so that is essentially our study site. And so a lot of our research questions are asking questions across urban to rural gradients or across gradients in other social factors. And I know that all of you are familiar with the Twin Cities, but just in case you haven't thought about it quite this way, one of the reasons that we're interested in the Twin Cities is because it's diverse, both in terms of its ecology, but it's also diverse in terms of its governance. So we are here at the confluence of these 2 major rivers. We're also at the intersection of 3 major North American biomes. And we also have quite diverse governance. So we have, governance at the entire metro region with Met Council. We have 7 counties. We have 110 or more municipalities. We have 33 different watershed districts or watershed management organizations. So there are these 2 large cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, but sometimes we forget that there are so many other municipalities in the Twin Cities metro, with a total population of about 3 million. I also wanted to mention that throughout our work, the researchers and educators that are part of our team are mindful to acknowledge that what we now call the Twin Cities are the historical and cultural and present day lands of the Dakota people, and that what we call the confluence of the Minnesota and the Mississippi Bdote is the center of the Dakota origin story. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do in our work is to challenge ourselves to use our position of privilege and power to elevate the voices of Indigenous as well as Black and other people of color. And I'll talk a little bit about some of that work throughout actually. Okay, so this is our conceptual framework for the LTER. We're really interested in understanding the relationships between urban nature and people, both towards understanding how urban ecosystems respond to urban stressors, rapid environmental and social change, and also to understand the benefits and burdens that urban nature confers upon people in the city, and to inform approaches for addressing inequities in who's basically experiencing those benefits and burdens, ultimately towards improving environmental outcomes for all residents. And so we have a series of 4 overarching questions that I'm going to just talk about at a very high level. So first of all, we're interested in understanding interactions between land use and management, these urban stressors, climate change, biodiversity, and influencing terrestrial ecosystems. We've been focusing especially on urban forests as well as urban pollinator communities. We're asking a similar suite of questions in aquatic ecosystems across a diversity of types of aquatic ecosystems, from stormwater to ponds to streams to lakes. On the social science side, we're interested in how decision-making, both in the past and going forward, influences environmental inequities. And finally, we're interested in studying how engaging in inclusive and in community-engaged research alters both the outcomes for the research that we do as well as the outcomes for the communities that we're engaging. So I obviously will not be able to talk about all of this today. Today, I'm mostly going to be focusing on a little bit of work on the aquatic side, and then I'll touch on some of these other questions as we go along. Okay, so I know some of you are really familiar with sort of the key features of stormwater and surface waters in the Twin Cities Metro, but others of you may be more terrestrially focused and not aware of these sort of attributes. So I wanted to kind of remind us all that in the Twin Cities, we have separated sanitary and storm sewers. And so that means that sewage is treated centrally, but stormwater is not. And that's important in the context of what I'm going to be focusing on today. As I mentioned previously, non-point nutrient pollution then becomes a really important issue. And we have abundant surface water, and clean water is highly valued by everyone. It's a bipartisan issue. This is just a reminder of all of the surface water that we have here in the metro region. And there's a lot of variability in terms of the quality and the water quality trends in these surface waters. So a lot of our surface waters look like this for some of the year. So they're impaired by high levels of nutrient inputs that lead to eutrophication, so high levels of algal growth. And then when those algae die and decompose, that drives down oxygen levels, which has a whole suite of impacts on the biodiversity of these systems. This is just showing a map of surface water quality impairments in the metro region. So this is an assessment of more than 1,000 lakes, and 70% of the assessed lakes are impaired for one or more stressor. And so the most important stressors are related to excess nutrient loading and chloride. I'm not going to talk about chloride today, but we are starting up quite a bit of work in the LTER on chloride. So if you want to ask me about that, I can try to tell you about it. But I'm going to be focusing primarily on nutrient loading. So to start out with, I want to describe this watershed approach that we've been taking to understanding urban nutrient pollution. So this is really an approach that we're borrowing from an approach that was pioneered in the streams of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. These are the White Mountains. Those are my 2 kids way back in the day when they were little and cute. This approach, the small watershed approach, was really pioneered at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. And there, scientists realized that they could learn a lot about how a watershed functions by basically constructing whole watershed water and nutrient budgets. And so by comparing the water and nutrients coming into these watersheds with the water and nutrients being exported, in the stream, lower down in the watershed, they could learn something about the processes influencing the cycling of water and nutrients within the watershed. And so if we conceptualize an urban storm sewer shed, you know, it has a lot of features that make it function potentially quite differently from, say, a non-urban watershed. So for example, in our urban storm sewer shed, we have a really dense drainage network that reaches high up into the landscape. We've removed a lot of the wetlands. And so if you are, you know, going around Minneapolis and St. Paul, you don't see a lot of the wetlands that used to be a really important part of this landscape. So this has implications for how water and nutrients are moving through these landscapes. So in our non-urban watershed, you know, if we're interested in understanding the nutrients that are being exported to a particular lake or a coastal zone, then we want to understand what are the nutrients that are coming into that watershed and how are those nutrients being retained or cycled as they move through soils into headwater streams, down through those, you know, those streams and through any potential wetlands along the way. In our urban system, we likely have greater rates of nutrient inputs to these watersheds, and there aren't a lot of opportunities for those nutrients to be captured or retained before they move into our storm drainage network. And then, you know, there's very little opportunity for those nutrients to be retained as they move downstream. And so we would expect that we would have sort of higher fractions of nutrient inputs entering surface water bodies. So we've been applying this small watershed approach to urban storm sewer sheds by essentially measuring or estimating the new inputs of nitrogen and phosphorus to residential urban landscapes, and then comparing those inputs to outputs in storm drains. And so we hoped by taking this approach that we would gain some new insights into the sources of nutrient pollution to urban surface waters. And so we applied this small watershed approach to subwatersheds of the Mississippi River in the city of St. Paul. So we're zooming in now, basically onto St. Paul. And these are the subwatersheds that we focused on. And we were super fortunate to be able to partner with Capital Region Watershed District. So they have a number of monitoring stations throughout St. Paul where they've been basically putting together annual budgets of nitrogen and phosphorus export from these subwatersheds of the Mississippi. So these are all storm sewer sheds in the colored blobs, and then the red dots represent the monitoring stations that Cap Region has been monitoring. And so just to make sure you understand what these watersheds look like, they're highly residential. So a lot of the area of the watersheds look like this, but there are areas that are commercial and industrial. And these watersheds include the St. Paul campus. So there's a little bit of agricultural land as well. Okay, so we first asked, what are the sources of nutrients to these urban watersheds? And then are these nutrients retained or exported? And if they're exported, what are the major nutrient export pathways? So first, what are the sources of nutrients to urban watersheds? So we took a interdisciplinary approach to addressing this question. We had a pretty extensive mail survey where we asked householders about things like pet ownership, which will become important as you'll see, their use of fertilizer on their landscape, what they were doing with their yard waste. Were they taking it off site? If so, where? What were they doing about importing things like mulch? We used modeled rates of nitrogen and phosphorus deposition. We did a little bit of field work to try to estimate nitrogen fixation rates. So I can talk about in more detail about those methods, but I'm not going to say too much more about that now. So these are the results that we got for watershed nutrient inputs. So we have nitrogen on the left and phosphorus on the right. And each of these stacked bars represents one of our watersheds. And I've just arranged them from the most residential to the least residential. So if we start with nitrogen and look at the nitrogen inputs to these watersheds, the dominant nitrogen input is residential fertilizer, followed by atmospheric deposition and household pet waste. And so remember that we have separated sanitary and storm sewers in the Twin Cities. So any of the nitrogen that is coming into a watershed that is consumed by people, that nitrogen is actually going into the sanitary sewer system and is basically bypassing these storm sewer sheds. So we're not considering that here. We're assuming that these, that our storm sewer and our sanitary sewer systems are well maintained, which they are. And so there's not a lot of leakage across them. In other parts of the country, that's not the case. But pets, when you go to the store and buy pet food and you feed it to your dog, and then you take your dog for a walk, some fraction of that, the nutrients in that pet food end up in the landscape, depending on whether we're talking about urine or feces, and then what fraction of the feces are picked up by the pet owner. And so we had to make some assumptions about that based on limited survey data. But we were surprised that pets ended up being such an important player. I should also mention, I won't show you these data, but the distribution of residential fertilizer use across households is really skewed. So about 80% of the nitrogen fertilizer is being used by about 20% of households. And those are households that are using a lawn care company, or just a small number of households that use a lot of fertilizer. And then there are a lot of people that don't use any fertilizer. If we look at phosphorus, we see, no residential phosphorus fertilizer input. Why is that? Because we have, a state law that restricts the use of phosphorus fertilizer on residential landscapes. And so that means that the dominant input of phosphorus to these watersheds is pet waste, followed by atmospheric deposition. Okay, so then we wanted to know, are these nutrients retained or exported? So we needed to have information on export. And so this is the same kind of figure, except now we're looking at watershed outputs. So blue represents the storm drain export. So those are data coming from Capital Region Watershed District. But we also estimated export in street sweeping materials, household grass clippings removals. This was based on our survey work. Household leaf litter removal, again, based on our survey work. And then there's some agricultural products export here from the Agricultural Research Station. So the dominant exports are in stormwater, but there is also substantial export in yard waste, essentially. And so to get an idea of phosphorus and nitrogen retention, I'm just going to show you phosphorus today. We compared the net inputs of phosphorus to these watersheds by basically subtracting yard waste removal from total inputs to the storm drain export that was actually measured in these watersheds. And so each of the blue dots now represents one of these watersheds. The dashed line is the 1-to-1 line. So you can see that the phosphorus export in storm drains is, close to what the net inputs are. So very little retention of phosphorus in these watersheds. This is pretty different from a non-urban watershed where we think of phosphorus as being quite immobile. Phosphorus tends to not move through soil readily, but these urban watersheds seem to be very effective at exporting phosphorus. And so we were, thinking, okay, why are these watersheds so leaky for phosphorus? So this brings us to our next question of, what are the major nutrient export pathways? So again, thinking back to our sort of conceptualization of urban headwater streams as our city streets, there aren't a lot of mechanisms to retain phosphorus in these watersheds. If the phosphorus can get into the street, then it can be readily moved down into the storm drainage network and make its way into whatever surface water body is downstream. So what are some of the ways that nutrients can get moved into streets? So one way is through street trees. So trees take up nutrients, they invest those nutrients into their leaves. When they drop their leaves into the street, they only reabsorb about 50% of the nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, before they drop their leaves. And so leaves that drop into the street are relatively nutrient rich. And of course, that phosphorus is biologically available. There can also be runoff of nutrients into the street. So we were interested in these different pathways of the contribution of these different pathways to phosphorus inputs into streets and then ultimately into stormwater. So thinking about tree litter fall a little bit more, obviously there's a lot of tree leaf litter that comes into streets in the fall, but there's also material that's coming in litter fall throughout the growing season. So in the spring, we see a lot of flowers, and you'll start to see this now. A lot of the trees are starting to flower, so keep an eye on the streets. You'll start to see a lot of material falling into the streets. In the summer, we see seeds. These are green maple samaras here. So we do get a substantial material coming into streets from trees throughout the growing season. And so we have accumulating evidence that tree litter fall is an important source of nutrient pollution to stormwater. So this is one line of evidence. This is a synthesis of stormwater data that was led by Jacques Finlay and Ben Jenke. So they basically brought together data from now 90 watersheds throughout the metro, where various entities, watershed districts, watershed management organizations, municipalities, parks boards had collected data on stormwater phosphorus concentrations. And they compared that to the canopy fraction over the street. So just the proportion of the street that's basically covered by canopy. They looked at different forms of phosphorus, so total P, total dissolved P, soluble conductive P, as well as different forms of nitrogen. So you can see that there is a positive relationship between canopy cover and total phosphorus, even just looking at the event mean concentration of phosphorus in stormwater. The relationship is a little bit weaker or maybe saturating for nitrogen, but also positive relationship. Then we have a former student, Aaron Mittag, who went about actually trying to calculate the fraction of stormwater phosphorus export that was coming from litter fall phosphorus into the street. I'm not going to go into too much detail of how she did this, but basically she took advantage of some street sweeping studies that we had done. And if you're familiar at all with forest measurements of litter fall, the way that we do it is we go out in the forest, we stick out a basket, and then we collect the material at some interval, like every couple of weeks or every month, and then we weigh it and measure the nutrients in it, and we can get annual estimates of litter fall. So basically what she did was she said, okay, let's use the street as our litter basket. And so places where we were able to collect material where municipalities were sweeping on a frequent basis, we could get a pretty good estimate of what is coming into the street annually in litter fall, and then compare that to stormwater export of nutrients in those same in the watershed, essentially. So she looked at all of these different watersheds. So she expanded upon the work that we had done previously. And here the green dots represent basically the amount of phosphorus going into streets on a watershed area basis annually. And then the black represents the annual stormwater export from those same watersheds. And so on average, she found that 57% of the watershed phosphorus exports were coming from litter fall phosphorus. So a substantial amount. I just want to mention one other study. This is not work that we did. This was done by Bill Selbig in Madison, Wisconsin. Bill is at the USGS in Middleton. And what he did was he basically identified 2 small residential catchments in the town of in the city of Madison. And in one of those little catchments, they didn't do any sweeping. In the other, they went out and actually swept like by hand and removed everything on a weekly basis. So an extreme sweeping scenario. And that these 2 catchments had about 40% canopy cover over the street. And so these are Bill's results were basically, if you compare the control catchment with no sweeping to the treated catchment with weekly sweeping, you can see a great reduction in total phosphorus yield in stormwater, especially in the fall, which is the green bar. Okay, so we have a lot of evidence now that trees are an important source of nutrients to stormwater, an important mechanism for moving nutrients from land into water. We have some sort of, less quantitative, but more qualitative information that runoff can also be a really important pathway for transferring nutrients from streets to storm, or from land to streets and then downstream into stormwater, especially during extreme weather events. So this is just an example of an extreme rainfall event. So I think we're probably all familiar with the fact that rain events are becoming more intense here, especially in the early summer. And this was one of these extreme rainfall events. This is actually looking out of the window of our house, where there was basically water flowing from, the backyard between us and the neighbors, over, down onto the sidewalk, over the boulevard and into the street. So a lot overland flow and high connectivity between the street and the uplands, during this extreme rainfall event. And if we look at phosphorus loading in just a single small residential watershed during different years that had different precipitation levels, this is just showing the cumulative phosphorus being exported from this little watershed over the growing season. And you can see that in dry years, we have about the cumulative phosphorus being exported as in wet years, and that you get this kind of step-like function where you're getting a lot of phosphorus being exported in extreme rainfall events. The other time of year that we think is important for promoting this overland flow is during the snowmelt period. So this is results from a former student, Anika Bratt, who is now a faculty member at Macalester College, looking at snowmelt, nitrogen, and phosphorus loading in that same residential watershed, that small residential watershed, looking at cumulative total phosphorus over 2 years being exported from this watershed, and cumulative nitrogen being exported. And the main thing I want you to notice is that you basically get this, rapid increase in export during the snowmelt period, with about half of the total export occurring during snowmelt. We don't know exactly where that phosphorus is coming from. Is it coming from phosphorus that accumulated in the snowpack? Is it coming from material that accumulated on the street, over the winter? Is it occurring, in runoff over frozen soils? We don't have a good partitioning of that. So conclusions so far, we find that urban watersheds are effective at exporting phosphorus to stormwater, and that litter fall and runoff during intense rain and snowmelt events move substantial nutrients into storm drains. Okay, so now I want to talk about some management opportunities and challenges. And I just want to pause because sometimes when I give talks, people think, oh, so are you concluding that trees are bad in cities? And I want to just acknowledge that we get a lot of benefits from urban trees. And I also want to point out that those benefits are not equitably distributed across different communities. So here's a time when I want to highlight some of the work that we're doing in this new LTER, thinking about legacies of past decision-making for present-day environmental inequities. So this is work that I was not involved with, was led by Rebecca Walker. She was a PhD student at the time over in the Humphrey School. She's going to be starting a faculty position in geography here at the University of Minnesota in September. So what Rebecca showed was that there's strong coupling of past investments in parkland and present day nature benefits and racial exclusion in the city of Minneapolis. So here we're just looking at the city of Minneapolis. This is a map of race, percent non-Hispanic white population, temperature, surface temperature, parkland, and tree canopy cover. And then it's a little bit hard to see on this figure, but you can see all these tiny, tiny little black rectangles. All of those are the outlines of parcels with racial covenants that had racial covenants historically, where it was stipulated in the deed, the property deed, that it was that the homeowner could not sell to a person of color, essentially. And so what Rebecca showed was that historically, the property developers basically partnered with Minneapolis Parks to set aside parkland and improve park amenities in areas that were close to neighborhoods that had these racially discriminatory housing policies. So, and you can see a legacy of that. So even though these racial covenants are no longer legal, you can see legacies of those past racially discriminatory policies on the landscape today, where we see that, you know, where you had a lot of these racial covenants, you also have high investments in parks, high tree canopy cover. These areas are cooler, and they tend to be dominated by communities of white communities on the even to this day. Okay, so we want to figure out how can we have trees on the landscape, but not necessarily experience all the water quality detrimental effects of trees. And so this takes us to kind of thinking about management options for urban surface waters. So historically, the focus has really been on end of the pipe stormwater management, where, you know, the management has focused on either the impaired water body itself or just upstream of that water body. But we can also think of managing for nutrients higher up in the landscape. So more source control stormwater management, where we're either reducing new inputs or trying to reduce the movement of those nutrients from land into stormwater. And so these are just examples of end of the pipe stormwater management. You know, options that you might be familiar with, where basically these are focused on capturing and infiltrating stormwater downstream. So these are things like stormwater ponds, or this is a below ground infiltration area that's actually in my neighborhood that was installed by the Capital Region Watershed District. There's also in-lake management. So this is alum treatment in Como Lake. And this is something that's being studied intensively by one of the grad students with the LTER, Katie Pollock. And alum, I should mention, binds up phosphorus and reduces phosphorus concentrations and can reduce algal blooms that way. Source control, these are examples. So controlling inputs, and this is what we've already done for phosphorus, right? In the state of Minnesota, we have a restriction on phosphorus fertilizer use in residential landscapes. Can also capture stormwater upstream through things like curb cut rain gardens. But what I want to focus on is reducing land water nutrient flows through street sweeping. So we've had a couple of projects where we've been assessing the efficacy of street sweeping as a method of source control. So the first project we did a while ago now, this was led by Ross Bittner, who at the time was with the city he was with the city of Prior Lake. He's now with Edina. Larry Baker, Paula Kalinowski, who is now at MPCA. She was a grad student with us, and Chris Byarski, who was a technician. And one of the things that we found, and then we did a more recent study just a few years ago, where we partnered with more cities to essentially measure the amount of material and nitrogen and phosphorus in swept materials under varying conditions, including season and canopy cover. So these are data across the season, actually across the year, the snow-free part of the year, on the total phosphorus recovered in sweepings for a number of different cities. So this was basically just going out and sampling the swept materials from, you know, the city's regular street sweeping routes. And what we found was that the highest amount of phosphorus being deposited into streets, recovered in street sweeping, was not surprisingly occurring in the fall, in October and November. There were relationships with canopy cover, but there's a lot of variation actually that's not explained by canopy cover. We also see somewhat higher phosphorus in swept materials in June, another time where there's a lot of deposition into streets. And importantly, we found that leaf litter contributes a high fraction of phosphorus in swept materials in the fall. So this is just looking by month at the percentage of phosphorus in sweepings from litter fall. So we did a fractionation where we separated out coarse material that was essentially leaf or litter fall. And you can see that in the fall, we have, you know, almost 75% of the phosphorus in sweepings is coming from litter fall. And so this suggests then that if you sweep in high canopy neighborhoods in the fall, when you have a lot of material coming into the street, that street sweeping could be an effective way of removing that material. And so we actually did a cost effectiveness analysis of a bunch of different street sweeping routes. I'm just showing you two here. So this is basically considering the capital cost, the depreciation of the street sweeper, the fuel costs of collecting this material. And so we compared the cost efficiency in terms of dollars per pound, and we're using dollars per pound here because that's how, you know, public works engineers think, of a low canopy route and a high canopy route. And so the main thing that I want you to notice, this is, you know, now in 2009 dollars, but the point remains that, you know, if you sweep in a high canopy neighborhood in the late spring, early summer, or in the fall, the cost of removing phosphorus is, you know, $100 or less. And at least in a low canopy neighborhood, it's much more expensive. But this is still much less than it costs in terms of dollars per pound to install one of these structural control measures that I talked about previously. So this is a pretty inexpensive way to remove phosphorus from these watersheds and keep it out of the lake. It also has downstream benefits because it reduces the maintenance needs for these structural control measures or BMPs that might be downstream of the street. But street sweeping has some challenges. So, you know, the advantages are that it's effective for nitrogen and phosphorus removal if it's done at the right time of year and in the right place. And it can be very cost effective. It's hard to time relative to the phenology of trees. We have a lot of different species, more in our tree canopy than we used to, because we learned that it wasn't a good idea to plant monocultures in our street trees. It can be inconvenient for residents who need to park on the street. It requires capital investment in terms of the street sweeper. But what I want to highlight today is that there's also been a lack of a state certified pollution credit in Minnesota for street sweeping. So a lot of you know a lot more about this than I do, but for those of you who don't think about stormwater pollution control regulations, you know, we have these federal programs that are implemented by states and enacted by municipalities, including the MS4 permit system and the TMDL system, where basically these entities need to apply for permits to discharge stormwater. And historically, I think I'll just so, you know, these programs are designed to reduce pollution entering our surface waters. It requires cities with these separated sewers to develop stormwater pollution prevention plans, and only certain actions reduce credit in these plans. And to date, street sweeping has not received credit, or it's been greatly undercounted. And so we worked with Mike Trojan and David Fairbairn at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to basically develop a data-driven pollution reduction credit for street sweeping based on our data. And so now municipalities have a tool that they can use to estimate the amount of phosphorus that they're removing in street sweeping and get credit for that in their MS4 permits. And I can tell you more about that if you want to know. This has been rolled out then through Extension. So Extension has developed workshops. So Maggie Karchnia and Paula Kalinowski have developed workshops for public works departments statewide to inform them about the street sweeping credit. And then this program is now being adopted. A similar program is now being adopted in the state of New Hampshire. So this has been exciting for us to see our research be turned into regulation. So conclusions for this part then are that, you know, street sweeping at the right time and in the right place is cost effective for managing nutrient pollution, and adoption of street sweeping as a management strategy required regulation changes and engagement with managers. But we are starting to see now that municipalities are starting to adopt this enhanced street sweeping. So I want to end by just touching on a little bit on some new directions that we're going. And I want to just highlight some of the community engaged work that we've been doing and how that has led us in novel directions. So some of you may be familiar with Walk on Teepee, which is a nature preserve and park on the east side of St. Paul. It's managed by an indigenous-led organization, Walk on Teepee, Awanyankapi. Maggie Lorenz is the executive director. This is a site that is at the same time a sacred site to Dakota people. There's a cave on that site that is a sacred site, but it's also been a heavily abused site. It's been a dump and a rail yard. And so Wakantipi Awanyankapi was really interested in whether there were legacies of these past abuses that might influence like the toxicity of plants that people were interested in collecting for either medicine or for food. So they reached out to us and asked us if we could make some measurements of heavy metals in the soils, in the plants, in some of the aquatic organisms. And that has led us into a new direction where we've started measuring heavy metals throughout St. Paul. So this is looking at the soil lead concentration in St. Paul parks. This is work that Emily Snellroot and Tim Mitchell have led, just arranged by from low to high. And so you can see there's, you know, a lot of parks that have really low levels of lead, but then we have these outlier parks that have quite high levels of lead, and some of those levels are higher than the current EPA recommended level above which you should do lead screening. And so this is just kind of mapping that onto St. Paul. And so you can see that there's, you know, a lot of these areas that have quite high lead levels. And so then this led us to think about how all the stormwater data that, you know, Jacques and Chip and others and Ben were pulling together and to look at some of these heavy metals. And so this is now showing the runoff lead concentrations in watersheds, again, throughout St. Paul. And you can again see some of these same areas lighting up as having quite high lead concentrations, not just in soil, but also in stormwater runoff. And then finally, Natalia Mosman-Cook, who has been a postdoc with Daniel Stanton in EEB, has been using lichens as a low-cost way of doing air quality monitoring throughout the Twin Cities metro. And sure enough, what they found was when they measured the lead that accumulated in these lichens after 10 months, as well as the zinc, you see some of these same areas lighting up as having high lead concentrations in air pollution as well. And so we think what's going on here is that actually this is the downtown St. Paul airport, and currently the small aircraft aren't regulated in terms of lead in the fuel and jet fuel. And so they use leaded fuel. And so we think that, that a lot of this lead is actually coming from the aircraft that are being serviced by that, that airport. That lead in that fuel is scheduled to be phased out by the EPA. Who knows? Well, that will be happening. There's also a more local story where we are also seeing high levels of lead adjacent to older homes. So this is something that we're just starting to tease apart and understand. So then my overall conclusions are that, taking a watershed approach to understanding urban water quality has led us to novel insights and solutions, and that engaging with community partners is leading us further to novel solutions, to novel research directions and new discoveries. So I want to just finish by acknowledging tons and tons of funding sources and partners and collaborators who've been a part of this work over the years. So thanks, happy to take any questions. Yeah.
I have like two questions kind of. First, really great presentation. I thought it was very interesting. So I kind of logged on to the dog poop kind of relationship.
A lot of people do.
And so I'm curious, like, if that was something that you guys kind of thought might be a large driver of phosphorus prior to doing that stuff. Yeah,
I think we didn't quite appreciate how important it would be in terms of the whole budget. So we had originally, that project was originally aimed at actually doing household budgets. And then I realized that, oh, hey, we could actually scale this to the watershed scale. And so at the household level, we were just thinking about like all the different ways that phosphorus could enter a household. And so pets was an obvious thing to look at. We didn't necessarily realize that it would scale, be important, at the watershed scale. And so, that's, of course, you have to think about, that's all of the phosphorus coming into the landscape. It's not necessarily what's ending up in stormwater, because it's coming into land, that depends on sort of this. There's a lot of spatial heterogeneity in where pet waste ends up and how vulnerable it might be to getting moved into streets and stormwater. But it is satisfying that now if you go around the chain of lakes in Minneapolis on the weekends, they have these signs up that say, pick up after your dogs, because, that's an important source of phosphorus pollution to these lakes. So, yeah.
And so my other one then is more end of the talk. We were talking a lot about how there is large variation in tree canopy cover, like based on kind of the how essentially white the neighborhood is. And then you were also discussing how it is much more cost effective to sweep in areas with high tree canopy cover. I'm curious if you have any like thoughts or concerns about like sweeping in areas with high tree canopy cover that are primarily white.
So like sort of privileging those areas. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I think that then you can think about, I think it would be then important to consider who's benefiting from any water quality improvements that might result. So even if the street sweeping is happening, in particular neighborhoods, that the benefits of that street sweeping might actually, at least the water quality benefits might be felt by other residents. Obviously, well, yeah, I won't even go there, but so I think that the benefits might be more equitably distributed, even if the practice is happening in, certain neighborhoods. Yeah.
I'm curious, do you see or expect water quality benefits and at what scale? I'm curious, like how much of phosphorus budget in these lakes is legacy?
Yes. Yeah. So this is, so this is like the, whatever, $6 million question. So that's a super important question. And I think that it raises the issue of, you know, like, let's say a watershed district is working with the city to do enhanced street sweeping, and then residents are like, oh, look, they're sweeping more, so our lake should have better quality, you know, like tomorrow. And of course, that's not true because of legacy phosphorus. And so there, you know, of course, it's going to depend on the mean residence time and of the lake and what the history of, you know, inputs are. But there's going to be a lag. And so, you know, probably what that means in practical terms is that, and this is, I think, what we're starting to see is that these managers are going to be, you know, maybe trying to reduce inputs to the lake, but then in order to show short-term benefits, they might be doing alum treatment, but maybe it would, you know, then reduce the need for future alum treatments if we can at least cut off some of this input. But yeah, there's definitely going to be lags, and the, you know, what those lags are going to look like is going to depend on the particular lake that you're talking about. Yeah.
My parents' neighborhood in Kentucky, they actually the city pays to get the leaves out and residents just rake everything into the street.
Yeah.
Which I can imagine why, look at like my neighborhood, lots of children. After doing your whole yard, if you have anything left in your bins, if anything left in your tank, you can street. But a lot of people will stop and you just still have all of the leaf litter in the street. And so
Yeah.
I'm curious, what you think that, you know, because they're thinking about willingness to pay too. Think about not having to take all your leaves to the compost center, and if you actually got everything instead of just stopping the street.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I don't really have an answer to it, except that there's just so many interesting contrasts. So in general, that is not a practice that's done here across municipalities. Roseville used to do it, but they don't do it anymore. Prior Lake, not Prior Lake, Mankato does it. So there are municipalities around that do that. They do it in Madison. And when I've talked to folks in Madison, like now, like if the city tried to not do that, like there would just be, you know, this uproar because everybody expects now that the city is going to provide that service. It's definitely an increase in cost for the city. And so, you know, I think the municipalities here are just like, you know, we don't want to go there because it's an added expense that we would have to take on. We're gonna leave that as something that homeowners are gonna need to pay for. There is the Adopt a Drain program. And that program is basically aimed at trying to get residents to augment the city's street sweeping program by adopting a drain and, you know, keeping that drain clear. And I always emphasize, you know, it's not just the drain that has to be kept clear. You know, you have to keep everything upstream of that drain clear or work with your neighbors to do that. And there are also some neighborhood street or leaf pickup efforts. So there's actually one in the Como Park neighborhood that are basically, it's just a citizen effort to, again, try to supplement what the city is doing, because the city is, for the most part, only sweeping once in the fall. So yeah, there's all sorts of interesting questions around that whole issue. And then the other big issue that I think a lot about, and we're starting a project, hopefully with LCCMR funding with Paula and Maggie, on just, okay, so if a city does sweep up this material, then what happens to it? And is there a way that we can create like a circular phosphorus economy where instead of just, you know, removing all this phosphorus from the street, can we, you know, end up with bringing that phosphorus back into the landscape where maybe it, you know, isn't having a detrimental effect. But then there's all these concerns about, what are the other kinds of pollutants in the swap materials like microplastics and PFAS and heavy metals, and, you know, is that material appropriate for composting and use on residential landscapes? So yeah, lots of interesting questions related to that particular issue.
So, maybe that- not sure if Sarah wants to stick around in this.
Thanks so much for coming, yeah.